Okay, in this presentation, we're going to talk about a common saying that we hear today. Many people will say that they are spiritual but not religious, and we're going to look at the popularity of alternative spiritualities. This was done with our campus apologetics ministry at the Ohio State University and Columbus State Community College here in Columbus, Ohio. I think that anyone that has gone out and talked to anybody about the God question or what they believe about the Bible or anything about spirituality has probably heard some of these sayings. They're very common, such as, I'm spiritual but not religious, or I believe in a higher power, or I believe in a spiritual realm, but I don't adhere to any particular religion. Very common sayings today. So in this case, sometimes religion is seen in a negative fashion. Religion sometimes can be seen as responsible for all the wars and conflicts around the world. It can be seen as responsible for many of the ills in the modern world and evils throughout history. Religion is associated with judgmentalism, and religion can be seen as only caring about doctrine or orthodoxy, having those correct beliefs. So when you try to define religion, spirituality, these are some general definitions here. So religion is sometimes seen as a set of beliefs and rituals that claim to get a person a right relationship with God, whereas spirituality is seen as having a focus on spiritual things in the spiritual world instead of physical earthly things. And then religion tends to substitute heartless observance of rituals for genuine relationship with God. So that's the negative aspect of religion. And then spirituality tends to substitute connection with the spirit world for genuine relationship with God. And of course, both of these and often are false paths to a genuine relationship with God. Sometimes when people say they're spiritual, not religious, they mean if I am very spiritual, there are no demands upon me other than what I do to follow my own sense of what I currently prefer. Because the false God is the God I have invented, because God is no longer a someone or a personal being, God becomes just some sort of vague idea, an impersonal force that makes no demands on the individual and simply there so that they don't have to feel lonely. And that's what happens a lot of times when people believe or say they're spiritual but not religious. If you probe deeper and ask them questions, they will say God is not personal. They believe God is just some sort of impersonal force that they're not accountable to. Obviously, this makes it a lot easier. They prefer just to have some sort of spiritual force in their lives or a higher power because they don't have to be accountable to that impersonal force. So this ends up that they can reject orthodoxy and focus on orthopraxis, which is how they can just live out their lives. Now, one of the most common misconceptions about spirituality is that there are many forms of spirituality and all are equally valid. Meditating in unusual physical positions, communing with nature, seeking conversation with the spirit world may be seen as spiritual. So if you ask people how they define their spirituality when they're spiritual but not religious, sometimes they will talk about some of these things they do, such as communing with nature and other things. Of course, some people who are spiritual but not religious turn to other things, such as tarot cards, different kinds of card decks. They turn to certain idols and statues. They turn to crystals, crystal balls, crystal wands, crystal jewelry, crystal stones. And this all goes back to the issue of the New Age movement. When I was a new believer in the early 90s, the New Age movement was being discussed, and I was told that it was being talked about in the 80s, and I was told then it was talked about in the 70s. The New Age movement is nothing new. It's still out there. That book in the middle here, The Second Coming of the New Age, talks about where we're at today with it because nothing's really changed. There's just all kinds of different alternative spiritualities that are out there. So all this stuff we're talking about is really part of the New Age movement or has some relationship to it. So it comes to talking about some of the tenets of the New Age movement. The New Age movement has many subdivisions, but is generally a collection of Eastern influenced metaphysical thought systems, a conglomeration of theologies. The term New Age refers to the Aquarian Age, which according to New Age followers is dawning. It's supposed to bring in peace and enlightenment and reunite man with God. Thirdly, man is presently considered separated from God, not because of sin, but because of a lack of understanding and knowledge concerning the true nature of God and reality. And fourth, the New Age movement is a religious system with two basic beliefs: evolutionary God personhood in global unity. As I said before, while borrowing heavily from Christian vocabulary, the God in the New Age movement or alternative spirituality is really just an impersonal force or energy. And the God in the New Age movement is nobody special. He or it is really everything. There's nothing that isn't God. So this leads us to the issue that a lot of the beliefs in alternative spiritualities, or I am spiritual but not religious, or New Age beliefs, are associated with monism, which is a physical worldview in which all reality can be reduced to one thing or substance. Same thing with pantheism. They view everything, or that God is in everything. God is in the rocks and the trees. He's one with nature. He's not separate from the creation. He's one with the creation because everything is God. So you'll talk to some people and they'll say the tree is God, the rock is God, God's in everything. Comes up all the time. And that's part of the New Age belief system. Some other aspects of New Age thinking. There's a change in consciousness. If we are God, we need to know we are God. We must become cosmically conscious, enlightened. There's a cosmic evolutionary optimism that's taught. There is a new age coming. There'll be a new world order, a new world government. New Agers can create their own reality. They believe they can create reality by what they believe. And by changing what they believe, they can change reality. So, in all honesty, some people in the New Age movement or alternative spirituality just believe that if they believe something hard enough, that can make it true. That makes it true. They can create their own reality. A lot of people in this line of thought believe that whatever feels good is what matters, as long as you're not hurting someone else. Of course, this is associated with moral relativism, which is situational ethics, and pluralism, which advocates universal tolerance of all beliefs. And of course, many people involved with alternative spiritualities have rejected what they call the narrow-mindedness of Christianity that teaches Jesus is the only way of eternal salvation. They believe more in a Christ principle or Christ consciousness. Oprah Winfrey is someone that's been talked about a lot with her kind of smorgasbord of spirituality. She kind of mixes them all together. This is what she says here. This is quoted in a Christianity Today article. She says, "I thought Jesus came, died on the cross, and that Jesus being here was about his death and dying on the cross, when it really was about him coming to show us how to do it, how to be, to show us the Christ consciousness that he had, and that consciousness abides with all of us. There couldn't possibly be just one way. You think if you're somewhere on the planet, you never heard the name of Jesus, but yet you live with a loving heart as Jesus would. You live with a loving heart as Jesus would have had you to live, but you are on some remote part of the earth and you never heard the name Jesus. You cannot get to heaven, you think." So Oprah spirituality has been discussed a lot, but a lot of it is associated with a lot of New Age beliefs. So the problem is with a lot of these alternative spiritualities goes back to the truth question, and that's the issue. If nothing is true, then everything is true, because in other words, if nothing is true in the objective sense, then anything is possible. In the subjective sense, anything can be true for me. And that's what we're dealing with these beliefs, an issue of the loss of objective truth. Ravi Zacharias said right here, how do you reach a generation that listens with his eyes and thinks with its feelings? There's a lot of people that base their spiritual belief off emotions alone, especially people who are caught up in alternative spiritualities like the ones we're mentioning. So people are no doubt trying to fill a spiritual void here. There's no doubt they're seeking. As we see by the impact of the New Age movement, many people are looking to fill a void. However, these people are greatly impacted by postmodern thinking, and they don't seem to care that much about objective truth, and they are undiscerning. So we're talking about postmodernism. This is a good book that helps you understand the pros and cons of postmodernism. This presentation isn't a thorough critique of postmodernism, but there's no doubt a relationship between some postmodern thinking and the New Age movement. And as it says here on page 13 of this book, which I have, it says the contemporary movement of thought, or postmodernism is the contemporary movement of thought which rejects totalities, universal values, grand historical narratives, solid foundations to human existence, and the possibility of objective knowledge. Postmodernism is skeptical of truth, unity, and progress, and opposes what it sees as elitism and culture, and tends towards cultural relativism, celebrates pluralism, discontinuity, and heterogeneity. So Anyway, if you want to learn more about postmodernism, get that book. So spiritual, no doubt, can imply that you're free from an unnecessary dogma. You can be yourself before God. You can mix faiths together because God is just a mix of all the different faiths. He's a mix of Buddhism, Muhammad, Jesus, whatever you want. And the sad thing about this is that many people are caught up in this simply don't seem to care about objective truth. You could tell them that you rely on objective truth all day long, or even just the fact that you rely on things being true every day of your lives, such as you want true bank statements, you want your prescriptions from doctors to be true, you want teachers and professors to give you true instructions, you want friends and families to tell you the truth, you want your politicians to tell you the truth, you want true instructions on how to use something you purchase. So we seem to rely on truth all day long, but then when it comes to pursuing the God question, these people seem to just throw that out the door. Either they just don't think truth can be known, or they certainly just don't think you can know anything objectively. And in many cases, they've rejected the correspondence theory of truth, which is the most classical view of truth we have. And of course, correspondence theory of truth is something we apply to our lives every day. When we make a statement, we believe we're making claims that correspond to reality. If I say I'm going to the store at 2 o'clock, I believe that there's actually a real store down the street from me that I'm going to. It's not just based on my subjective feelings. It really exists in reality. But many people in the New Age movement, of course, this alternative spirituality, believe in really adhere to a pragmatic view of truth. And that's on the bottom. They simply stick with what works for them or what's beneficial. They don't really care if it corresponds to reality, and they don't seem to think through it. So a lot of times they'll just pick a spirituality that they think is making a difference in their lives, even if it doesn't correspond with reality at all. So if you want to believe that you commune with trees and trees help you to be a better person, that may not correspond to reality at all, but if it seems to make a practical difference in your lives, it's all that matters to these people. So sometimes when it comes to alternative spiritualities, a lot of it has to do with perception. They think their perception shapes reality. And number one, as I say here, the idea that perception is reality is sometimes taken to mean the person's perceptions may dramatically shape or inhibit how they engage with reality. The perception is reality advocates face the problem. Is this just your perception, or is it that your view that's ascribing the reality of everyone else's situation? So it'd be either trivial, just another perception we can safely ignore, or incoherent, describing the way things really are. So to say your perception shapes reality is very, very tricky. But that's what a lot of people believe, and that's in this situation, that's what they adhere to. And of course, some of the questions I ask people who deal or who are caught up with alternative spiritualities and that God is just an impersonal force or God is a higher power, I ask them for their evidence that God is an impersonal force or that God is not personal. I ask them if they care about any evidence for their claims. Do they care if it's even true? If they believe in truth in all other areas of their lives, why would they not care if this is true? And then I ask them if they want to know if there's a God who's personal. Is there an issue of moral accountability? Because if a personal God exists, that means that they would possibly be morally accountable to that personal God. Then thirdly, I ask them who they think Jesus is. What do they think about Jesus? Because as we know, Jesus claims to reveal the one true God who is personal. So those are some basic questions you can ask them. Of course, they may not care. Of course, they may throw a lot more subjectivity at you, but at least those are some questions to ask. One way I might show that there is a personal God is to talk about the cause and design of the universe, because I don't think we can, I think it's pretty evident that no impersonal force can account for the beginning and fine-tuning of the universe. For example, when you look at some of the standard cosmological arguments and we offer up a first cause and we talk about there being no time, space, matter, they're codependent on each other. It's hard to say that the beginning of the universe was a result of an immaterial, or it was a result of some sort of impersonal force, because the beginning of the universe means that something had to come from nothing to something. Now, I know there's many definitions of nothing. We can talk about that another time. But the point is that we're saying the beginning of the universe was a result of a free act of a will by an immaterial conscious agents who can exist outside of space and time. That whatever converted nothing to something or brought the beginning of the universe into existence involves a choice. It involves a will. And that cannot be accomplished by an impersonal force. It has to be a personal being. And of course, remember, scientific explanations deal with impersonal objects and the laws of nature, and we observe how to measure some events. But there are also other explanations of reality called personal agent explanations, and that's where you involve a person making a choice. There's motive, there's will, there's intention, there's means to carry out a purpose. And so, for example, if I decide to teach this presentation or teach this material, I have an intention. I start out with an intention that this will lead to personal growth and edification, and I have the power to exercise my will to make this happen, and the result, of course, the end goal is that people are equipped, edified, and strengthened. So that's what we call a teleological explanation. Obviously, within the New Age movement, alternative spiritualities, there's not really any teleological explanation. It's more dealing with just impersonal things. And so just remember the difference here. Remember also, when it comes to talking about a personal God, you can talk about this. Obviously, all of us have to live our lives successfully. We try to live our lives successfully by planning well. We know we have to plan our education. We have to plan our health. We write up wills and plans for retirement. We rely on government to pass bills that always think ahead, that plan for the future. So everything in life involves a plan, a lot of planning ahead, a lot of thinking and looking for an end goal. You have to look at the end goal in mind. And so when it comes to that, if you think about the way the universe was set up, it had to have some sort of advanced planning, because if the universe is not rigged a certain way, we wouldn't be here talking right now. That means the universe had to have some sort of personal agent behind it, because no impersonal force can plan ahead. Now, there's been enough books written about the fine-tuning argument and how the earth is rigged for life, but there's no doubt, there's not a lot of debate that the universe has to be set up a certain way for life to get going on Earth. There has to be a planning, has to be advanced planning. So the question is, how would an impersonal force plan ahead the universe, which allows us to have life on Earth? Even to get any evolution going on Earth, you'd have to have the right universe and the right planet set up. So is there an intelligent agent that wants sentient, self-aware, reasoning, personal creatures to exist? So that would definitely make a case for a personal God versus some sort of impersonal force. So remember that we're talking about science. Science doesn't deal with what we call efficient causation. It doesn't deal with the who behind certain things that we see in reality. It doesn't talk about personal agent explanations, and it definitely doesn't deal with final causation. It doesn't deal with the end goal or purpose or the why questions. Philosophy deals a lot with these other two questions. But the point is that if you're going to talk about or advocating a personal God in some way, or a God who's not in personal force, you may have to start out with a couple of those points. But then ultimately, you could talk about this. If God is not personal and everything's just an impersonal force, or the person believes in impersonal force, then they can definitely choose, if they want to deal with the claims of Jesus. Because if these 5 points are true and Jesus is who he is, then God is personal. So number one, if the New Testament documents are historically reliable, and then number two, the New Testament documents reveal that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, God incarnate, and he was raised from the dead. And third, that means that he's God incarnate, and how he viewed the Bible, then there's no doubt that the God of the Bible is a personal God, and Jesus has revealed him. So my experience when dealing with people like this are caught up in alternative spiritualities and saying they're spiritual but not religious. The bottom line issue that I've noticed, and this is only from my experience, I can't speak for everybody else, is that people that get caught up in that generally don't want to be accountable to a personal God. At least that's been my experience. And you can flat out get them to admit that point at some level. It's a lot easier to not be accountable to a impersonal force or some sort of higher power who doesn't ask you to do anything and doesn't require anything of you. So it's just a lot easier to believe in that than to believe in a personal God who calls you to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow his son on a daily basis. So I think a lot of people get caught up in these alternative spiritualities because they are seeking, but also they think that there's too much to give up to follow the gospel and too much to give up to follow Jesus. And so those are some of the things that come up, and I hope that maybe you can use some of this material when you talk to people about the times and they'll say to you they're spiritual but not religious. Have a good day.